Hello, thank you for watching my video. If you like my content, please feel free to subscribe, like and comment. Robert Duke of Normandy was born in around 1051, the eldest son of William the Conqueror and his wife Matilda of Flanders. He would live a seriously long life, not dying until 1134, when he was in his 80s. Robert would succeed his father as Duke of Normandy in 1087, and he would take the cross after Pope Urban II had preached the First Crusade in 1095. To raise money for this incredibly expensive venture, Robert handed over control of Normandy to his brother William, who had become King William II of England. Robert would never have full control of Normandy again. He would have known at the time what he was doing was a risk, but it would have been a risk worth taking. The crusade, as Pope Urban had preached it, would offer spiritual rewards, and Robert, like many of the other crusaders, would have believed they were doing God's work in ridding Jerusalem of infidels. And Robert would become one of the leading men on the crusade, and in the picture you see on the left of screen, he is depicted fighting during the siege of Antioch. The crusade was overwhelmingly successful, and Jerusalem was captured in 1099. When Robert returned to Western Europe, the political situation had changed. His brother, William, had died in a so-called accident in the New Forest in 1100, and his brother, youngest brother, Henry I, had become king. But now Robert faced a fight to regain control of the territory he had surrendered to William. And unfortunately for Robert, he would never gain control of Normandy, as he was bested by his youngest brother, Henry I. In 1106, Robert was defeated at the Battle of Tonchebray and was imprisoned for the next 28 years, until his death in 1134, just a year before Henry, who was Henry I of England, would die himself. The second son of William the Conqueror and Matilda was a boy called Richard. Richard, in the eyes of history, is long forgotten. The most curious and ironic thing about Richard is how he died. In around 1070, he died in a hunting accident in the New Forest. This is almost an eerie foreshadowing of what would come during the reign of his brother William II. Although in Richard's case, there is no doubt that his death was purely accidental. William II, as King of England, does not exactly have the most glowing of reputations, but this can be put down to his poor relationship with the Church, which as a result led to chroniclers being particularly disparaging of him. He was a capable soldier, but his reign is largely forgettable, and he is very often overlooked. In fact, the most memorable event of William II's reign, apart from the First Crusade, which happened outside of his jurisdiction, is in fact how William died. In 1100 he was out hunting in the New Forest. Whilst he was slowly making his way through the forest, he was struck in the heart by, supposedly, a stray arrow. The arrow had been fired by a man named Walter Tyrrell. Was this an accident? Well, William, like his father, was not a small man, and it's hard to believe that he could have been mistaken for perhaps a deer or another animal, which is sometimes the excuse given for Tyrrell's supposedly poor aim. What is also more suspicious is the fact that amongst William's party was his youngest brother, Henry. Henry, having been virtually disinherited on his father's death, now stood to gain everything, and indeed, 3 days after his brother had expired in the New Forest, he became King of England. Whilst this all may seem to be circumstantial evidence, I think it does point to the fact that William II was murdered, and there is a marker in the New Forest now where he died. Three days after William II had supposedly died accidentally in the New Forest, on August 5th, 1100, Henry I became King of England. This was quite a rise for a young man who had only inherited a relatively modest amount of money on the death of his father in 1087. But Henry I would not stop there, and in 1106, as I mentioned in the segment on Robert Duke of Normandy, he would also take control of the Duchy of Normandy and imprisoned Robert for the remainder of his life. So, having gone from relative obscurity, Henry I was now King of England and controlled Normandy. After this meteoric rise, Henry set about establishing law and order in his kingdom, which he did so quite successfully. In fact, over a century later, Magna Carta would reference the just laws of Henry I in stark contrast with those of King John. This shows that Henry was a strong, reliable, and just king, even if the path to which he had reached power is more than a little bit suspicious. However, he was not a king without his flaws. One of his first flaws was the fact that he liked the women, and he is said to have sired perhaps as many as 24 illegitimate children. The reason that this is such a problem is the fact that he had only one legitimate son, and this legitimate son would die in the White Ship sinking of 1120, leaving Henry I without an heir. And by this point, his first wife was dead. So Henry I married again and tried desperately to produce another son. But his liking for the ladies had come back to haunt him, and he failed to produce one, which left him with little choice but to make his daughter, the Empress Matilda, his heir. He knew this would not have been popular. And indirectly, Henry I for lack of a better word, his horniness eventually led to 2 decades of civil war in England. If Henry had focused on producing legitimate heirs, which he clearly could have done, then the anarchy that we saw during the reign of King Stephen would have been entirely avoided. Another one of Henry's failings was his liking for lampreys. He used to devour these against his doctor's orders, and this came back to bite him, and in 1135, after eating far too many, he became ill and died, leaving England now prone to civil war. There are other videos that I have produced on Henry I and William II, and I shall provide the link for them in the description. There is a question mark over the exact number of children William the Conqueror had. It could be 8, it could be 9, it could be 10. There is doubt over the existence of 1 or 2 of William's children, and if they even existed at all. Unfortunately, there is a type of hierarchy when it comes to kings and queens' children in the Middle Ages. The most important child for a king was the firstborn son that survived into adulthood. And then after that, it will be the second-born son that survived into adulthood. Unfortunately, the later you're born, the less important you become. And unfortunately for the girls, unless they made particularly good marriages, or they went into the religious life and made a particularly good name for themselves, unfortunately, a lot of these daughters would be entirely forgotten about. And indeed, in the case of Adeliza, very little is known about her, and there is doubt over the existence of another couple of William's children, daughters who may or may not have existed. And unfortunately, this is a reality of the Middle Ages, sadly, that younger children and girls unfortunately do not take much of a front seat. Another daughter of the Conqueror who did make something of a name for herself was Cecilia, who was born in the late 1050s and died around 1126. As I mentioned earlier, if a daughter of a king wasn't going to make a good marriage, then the next best way for her to make at least something of a reputation for herself was to go into the religious life and do good works. And that's what Cecilia did. And so she does get more of a mention in Chronicles than her sister Adeliza. And the last 2 children of William the Conqueror that I am going to mention are Constance and Adela of Blois. Constance married the Duke of Brittany, and therefore became Duchess of Brittany, and Adela is probably the most famous of the daughters of William the Conqueror, as her son would go on to become King Stephen, usurping the Empress Matilda, Adela's niece and Stephen's cousin, in the process. And so that just about brings to a close my video on the children of William the Conqueror. I would really like to go into more detail about the daughters in particular, but as I say, I'm just not into guesswork, because a lot of historians do try and cover obscure, in particular female figures in throughout history, really. But as thorough as they are, their work still contains a lot of probablys, maybes, and it just becomes inundated with guessing. And unfortunately, one of the realities of life in the medieval period is that unfortunately a lot of potentially great women characters have sadly been lost to history, but it is also worth bearing in mind that there are a lot of male figures as well that have been lost to history. Young men like Richard, for example, who died young, that people don't know anything about. He could have gone on to become one of English history's greatest figures. Who knows? But unfortunately, it wasn't to be. Being the second son of William the Conqueror, Richard potentially could have become king in 1087, because the succession by William the Conqueror was divided as such that Robert, Duke of Normandy, the oldest, was made, as I say, Duke of Normandy, and therefore Richard would have become King of England, and then William II would have been the one completely disinherited, and Henry I would have been in an even worse position. So accidents like that have changed history, and Richard has, like the daughters, unfortunately, has completely vanished from the pages of history books. That's why I think doing a mini series on the children of kings and queens is quite interesting, because it just throws a light on people that have been long forgotten. Because although this last bit is going to sound really, really gloomy, one day we're all going to be long gone and forgotten about. And it would be nice, even in a few hundred years, for someone to talk about us and maybe remember us in some vague way. And that's why I'm going to continue to try and do these videos. And I hope they appeal to people.